Hello, video editors. We're back for another lesson in the basics of video editing, and today we're going to look at setting up a new project from scratch, and we're going to do that in both Final Cut Pro and in Adobe Premiere. So let's get started with Final Cut. There are a few things to know when making a new project, but the main thing you need to know is that you go to File and choose New Project, and then you've got one. I am on my fourth Untitled project here because I've been screwing it up a couple of times. In setting things up in this demo, so hopefully we'll get it right this time. So I'm going to go ahead and save that, just file save, and name that demo project attempt 4, and there we have it. And it gives you a sequence to start off with, so you have a timeline to edit with, and that's all you get. That's all you get in your new project. But there are a couple of other things that you want to pay attention to. There are a few settings in Final Cut specifically that are worth setting up and making sure you have ready to go, and that is your user system, preferences, and audio video settings. So first let's take a look at user preferences. There are a couple things going on here. There are a lot of options, and there are not a lot of things that you necessarily need to pay attention to, but it's worth making sure that you have your autosave vault on so that when you're editing and Final Cut, maybe doesn't work perfectly and force quits on you, you can autosave it. And so you can save a copy every 30 minutes by default and have a maximum of 25 projects. But as we learned in the other lesson, these project files are really, really small. We're not saving copies of your video over and over again. We're just saving the metadata that says what you're doing with that video. So really, you can up this to some crazy amount, and that's totally fine. You may not need 50 or 100 copies of your project saved every 30 minutes, but you may want 50 or 100 copies of your project saved every 5 minutes. So what you need to do here is set that to whatever makes sense. Moving on, let's take a look at the system settings. There's a little bit more here that's worth setting. First, your scratch disk. Naturally, this is going to end up in your Documents folder, but you can set it to wherever you want. Like I mentioned in the first lesson, I set these to the specific folder in which I'm working, so all the files are stored within that folder, in that project folder. Right now I'm not doing that. I'm just setting it to a temp scratch folder on my hard drive, and that's just fine. But if you want to set it for each project, every time you make a new project, you have to set the scratch disk, or I should say reset the scratch disk, by going to the File, or where did it go? Final Cut Pro menu, and choose System Settings, go to Scratch Disks, and set it. This will make your projects more portable. It is a little annoying, but the portability for me, because I work on laptops more than anything, is key. So totally up to you. So you have a couple more options here. Let's just take a look at some of these. The next one you're going to want to look at is Playback Control. By default, this is this RT setting, which is real time, is set to safe. I don't like to play it safe. I'd rather have the computer just show me the video unrendered as best as it can. So I set RT, or real time effects, to unlimited. And that is really those are the two main things you want to set in system settings. You have a couple of other stuff here, like your external effects handlers. I have them all set to Final Cut Pro, because if I'm going to do any external effects, I usually do them and then bring them in manually. I don't think that the communication in Final Cut Studio is phenomenal, so I just do it the hard way, rather than trying to rely on what it can and cannot import. So those are the two things you really want to set there. Lastly, we have our audio-video settings. This is where you kind of set the formats you're working with and the capture preset. If you have a specific kind of video camera, you set it here. Right now I have mine set to HDV, which is actually not what I want it set to, but I don't have my import plugin for the Canon DSLR cameras installed, so I can't select that right now. But you want to set your capture preset, and this is something when you first install Final Cut, it will actually ask you, to whatever camera you're using most often. And then you set whether it's a controllable device or not and how it's being controlled. And then you can set your sequence presets. The default for your sequence, I have mine set to 1080p at 24p for ProRes, the ProRes codec. So there are a lot of settings here, but you want to check off whatever it is that you are using. If you're editing in HDV, you may want to edit in HDV, or you may want to change over to ProRes for higher quality so it doesn't degrade when you re-render stuff. This is something that you have to choose in any video editor, the codec you're using in your timeline, the codec you're using to render your footage while you edit. Apple's Final Cut Pro comes with ProRes 422, which is a great codec. It's a little slower to render than Apple Intermediate codec, but it is a higher quality. So you can use this. You can also use other kinds of codecs, like a lossless codec. There's a codec, I forgot the name of it, but it's made by BitJazz, that is a lossless codec but takes up half the space of lossless footage. And so there are a lot of good codecs out there that don't necessarily come with the editor that you can purchase for a nominal fee and use for editing. DVC Pro HD is one that generally comes with your editor, so does HDV. And your camera probably has a preferred codec, so you want to edit in your camera's codec if it makes sense to do that. For example, XDCam is a great codec by Sony. So you want to set that here. You set your capture presets here, so you know what you're actually capturing to. If I was actually using an HDV camera, I would import the HDV footage, but it would be transcoded to Apple ProRes in this case. I could instead choose to keep it as HDV, but I don't want to do that. And you can set some other settings here that may or may not be applicable. These are things you're going to be setting up in any video editor, but that's what it looks like in Final Cut Pro. So you want to make sure that before you get started with a project, you have all your stuff together. You know what you're using, you know what your hardware is, you know what codecs it requires and what codec you want to edit in. And just in case you're not familiar with codec, it is a term that means it's kind of a combination of encoder and decoder, so code and decode codec, and that is referring to the format in which your video is compressed or not compressed if you're using lossless. So that's it. Now we are here in our demo project and we have no footage. We need to get footage into this project if we're going to edit. Now there are two ways in Final Cut that you do this. Go to the File menu and you'll find both of them. One is Login Capture and one is Login Transfer. Alternatively, if you have your footage just on a disk already, you can go ahead and import it just by dragging it into your bins, or into your main bin, your assets file browser right here. Now, if you want to get it from a camera or from a card, these are the two things that you use. Login Capture is the older way in that you have a camera that requires importing from a tape. And so if you choose this, it will try to initialize your camera and allow you to import the footage. Now, I don't have an HDV or DV camera connected, so it's not going to let me do that. But what I can do is go to Login Transfer. Now, I don't have anything set up here, but normally what will happen when you import your footage is a whole list will come up. When you have a camera connected that has MPEG streams, or you have a camera connected that's a DSLR, and you have the plugin set to import DSLR footage, and there will be a link in the actual notes for this lesson that will show you how to get that set up for your Canon DSLR if you want. Then you can go ahead and import the footage that way. And a whole list of clips will come up here. You'll select the ones that you want. You'll click Add Selection to Queue, and then you will click Automatic Transfer, and it will start transferring them into your Final Cut project. One thing you might want to do is go to the Preferences and choose what your encoding settings are, because in some cases you'll be able to import them as native, but in some cases you'll want to import them as ProRes or another kind of format. So you can choose between all the ProRes formats and Apple Intermediate codec if you're using AVC HD, which is popular for a lot of consumer and prosumer cameras. So that's great. I'm fine with these settings, and that's it. So you can. This is kind of what it looks like for the Login Capture version of Final Cut 2 for when you're importing that footage. Only you're actually setting in and out points for your tapes. So when you're going through the footage, you set the in point, play the tape to the out point, set the out point, and then click and add that to queue. And then when you're all done setting all that metadata for your footage for that tape, you can go ahead and click the import button, and then Final Cut will go through and play the tape, and it will make little clips out of all the points that you made. So that's really great, but nowadays we're using cards a lot more than tapes, so if you are one of those people shooting on a card-based camera, this is a lot easier because it already has that split up into clips for you. But if you're not and you're using DV or HDV to import your footage, it's still a pretty seamless process. It just takes a little bit longer because you have to go and set those clip points yourself. Alright, So let's pretend we have some footage in here. I'm just going to take a break 1 minute and I'll be right back with some footage so we can look at editing it and setting up our first sequence. Whoa, where did all that footage come from? I found it all over my hard drive. It's stuff that we shot for future episodes of the Lifehacker show, which, if you are interested, it's on revision3.com/lifehacker, so go check it out. I took a couple of things from various episodes in various formats from various cameras. We actually have footage from, I think, 3 different cameras here, and an opening credits that was encoded for the web, so we're going to see what happens when you start combining different kinds of footage in various ways. I'm going to drag this clip onto the timeline, and as we discovered yesterday, you get this nice little warning that says, wait a minute, this clip does not match the sequence's settings, and you know, who knows what the sequence's settings were, probably what we set them to in the preferences, some sort of 1080p ProRes situation. But I'm going to tell it, yeah, sure, you know what, set it to whatever the clip is, because that's going to be my editing base. You may not want this, though, if you want to edit in ProRes and just have everything converted. And so actually, let's give that a shot. And we're going to take a look at what happens. So here we are in a coffee shop with this clip, and you can see that it's green saying, yeah, I'm cool with this. Whatever format it's in. It happens to be in the Apple Intermediate codec at 1080p. But if I want to check out what I'm actually rendering to, I can go to Sequence, choose Settings, and there we are. So we're at 1080p, square, pixel aspect ratio, and we're rendering to ProRes 422. That's fantastic. So here we go. If I want to drag something else on here, let's see what happens. Let's actually take a look at if I drag this clip in as an SD file. Okay, so what's going on here? It looks kind of the same. There's our coffee cup. But let's double click on it, bring it up in the viewer, and then go to the motion tab to see what's happening. As you can see, Final Cut automatically scaled this up 300% because at 100% it looks like that. And that's kind of not the right size for us. So when you drag in clips that Final Cut is, you know, I don't know, less excited about because it doesn't match the settings exactly, it's not going to ask you every time to change your sequence settings. It only does that with the first clip. Once you've added something, it won't ask you anymore, and it will just try to, you know, make everything else fit what you're doing. So in this case, I have a 640 by 360 H.264 version of this same clip, which is in 1080p, but in Apple Intermediate codec. And this clip plays back a little bit better because it's in a codec that's easy to play back, whereas H.264 is a little bit choppier. I don't know if you can actually tell in the screencast, but it is. And it's being scaled up. Well, not anymore, but if I were to scale this up, there we go. There's that choppiness. And then we're also getting orange because H.264 is harder for it to re-encode into ProRes than Apple Intermediate codec, and we're not going to get into why that is, but Apple Intermediate codec takes up more space and is less processor intensive, so codecs like that are just easier for Final Cut to deal with. But you can put any format on the timeline, it'll just have an easier time with certain codecs. So I'm going to get rid of that because we don't want it twice. I'm going to take a look at some of this other footage we have here. This is from our photography episode, in which we have swinging glow sticks. Now, here's something that's interesting. We have an orange line and a red line. Now here, we have the green line. I'm just going to zoom up on this really quick. We have the green line and a gray line. Now, you probably didn't notice before that there are 2 lines here, but one of these is for video and one of these is for audio. Orange is saying, yeah, I'll play back that video, but I don't like it. And red is saying, I'm not playing back that audio at all. I don't know how to deal with it. I can't do it in real time. Which, I don't really believe that Final Cut. I think you probably could handle it, but it doesn't want to. So we're going to take its word for it and take a look at how to render things in the timeline. When you click on them, you can just go to, where is it? Render, there we are. Render selection. And you can choose both or just video and audio. And if you want to render both, or either, you have to select, well, what am I allowed to render in render selection? Now, sometimes you'll have a full preview or a full preview of the footage that will play back remarkably well, like here with the Apple Intermediate codec. And you can, if you choose to render that selection, if I were to click on this and choose Render Selection, an interesting thing happens. Nothing, because it doesn't really need to be rendered right now. So if you want to force it to render that footage, you can. You'll notice that if you go to Render All, you can choose to render all, and it will by default render all of that stuff. So when you're rendering a selection, it's just kind of like, okay, I need to render this right now, otherwise I can't do any more work. Or you can choose to render all, and then you're saying, I'm stepping away from the computer to go make a sandwich, so I'm just going to let it render whatever it wants, and while you're away, if Final Cut realizes you're away, it actually will render stuff for you. Now, you can choose rendering selection. I just always want to render everything right away. I like to just get it out of the way so I don't have to, I'd rather wait in increments rather than have to take a break, go for a run, make a sandwich, go to the bathroom for a while, or whatever it is you want to do. So you can choose those options here. Now, we need to render the audio before we can do anything else. So I'm going to go to Sequence, I'm going to choose Render Selection, and I'm going to choose Audio. We don't need to render the video, but the audio is really, really quick, so there we go. Now we're going to play that, and we've got two things going on. Now you can see the video is super choppy because it's trying to deal with a 1080p H.264 file. It doesn't like that. So there's some glow stick action going on there when we were doing light painting. But, you know, we've got it in there. You can edit it. It's also on a MacBook Air right now, so it's not going to decode that video quite so fast, but I will say, you know, on a much faster computer where I normally edit, it's not a whole lot faster with H.264. So hopefully that'll happen in future versions of the editing software. Anyway, that's how you get footage on the timeline. That's how you get multiple kinds of footage on the timeline and how you can render things as you're going along. We've looked at adding effects a little bit in the last lesson. Let's just take a quick look at that now. So if I click in between clips, you'll see here that I can add an effect. Now we have to shorten that up. So on both ends, so we have room for that transition. So I'm just clicking the edges and dragging them back. Now I have an empty space. I'm going to click that, hit delete. Select the space in between. Now if I hit Command T, it'll automatically apply the default effect, which is a cross dissolve, but you can set that to any effect in Final Cut Pro. Alternatively, I can hit Command Option T, and that will do an audio fade, which is the default effect for audio in Final Cut Pro. So I'm going to leave that. We want the audio to fade. I'm also going to go to Effects, and let's say we want to do a different transition. We can do the oval iris instead. So if I go ahead and render this, I'm going to hit Command R. That will render everything that's selected, and it's going to do this probably pretty slowly. But, you know, not the end of the world, even though it's a half of a second. Video rendering, especially at HD, can be a bit of a time-consuming process. So there we go. Now I play that back, and we have our effect. And that's basically how you do video editing in Final Cut. Now, we're going to get into much more complex stuff in the next 2 days, like bigger effects and color correction and all of that. But right now, I want to show you how to finish off a project so you can get it onto the web very easily. We're not going to look at all of those options on our final day on Friday. We are going to actually look at all your export options, how to transcode your video and deliver it into multiple formats using compressor, but you know, I prefer something else. So we'll look at those options as well, and how to do it from Premiere, which is actually slightly better in some ways. So for now, we're just going to look at actually exporting the file. Now, you'll notice I'm going to export, and I don't really have a whole lot of options. That's because right now I have this selected right here, this clip, instead of having the window focus on the timeline. Final Cut knows what you're doing. You have to have your focus on the timeline here before you go to File and choose Export. And then you can choose QuickTime Movie, QuickTime Conversion, or a whole bunch of other stuff. We're going to look at two things. First is QuickTime Movie. This will export it into the format that you already have. And there are two things you want to know here. First, you want to use the current settings. Alternatively, you can choose any of the other settings to export it in that format, in which case you're going to want to choose Recompress All Frames, which will recompress all frames, every single frame of the video, which is great if you want a really solid file in another format. It's not great if you want to get something exported really quickly, and you definitely want to make that file self-contained. Otherwise, it's just going to be a pointer file. It's going to be super small, and it's going to point to all the video on your computer. It will create a QuickTime file that's basically just a replica of your edit, but in QuickTime format that can be played back in any QuickTime player. So that's great if you're going to use it to do a quick transcode of the video in another program. But for the most part, you're going to want to make a self-contained movie, because then you can just put that file on a disk or a flash drive or whatever, give it to someone else, and they can do whatever they want with it. But recompressing all frames makes sure that everything is just one solid file and is compressed as a single file instead of a bunch of video added together as a full movie. So we're not going to do that because it takes a little while. But if you want to just compress the frames, then you're great. And you just name your sequence, hit save, and it will create a QuickTime file. And it will happen in a few minutes if you've already rendered everything. If you haven't, it will re-render everything for you in export. We're going to cancel out of there. The other option that you're looking at is using QuickTime conversion. QuickTime conversion is basically using QuickTime settings to go to any format QuickTime supports. To do this, you choose I want a QuickTime movie or any of these other formats, and then click options to choose your QuickTime options. This is an easy way to export for the web. It's not ideal, but it gets the job done. And if you know a few things about encoding, which if you don't, we'll be covering that later in another lesson. But if you know a few things already, you can go ahead and here and set your settings and export as a QuickTime file in various kinds of formats. Personally, I like to export as a QuickTime movie, the previous method that we used, which is the main one, Command E. And I like doing that because then I create a source file that is really high quality, the highest quality I'm going to get, because that's the same thing that I'm doing in Final Cut. And then I can choose to convert that into a variety of formats later. So that's basically how you make a quick and dirty edit in Final Cut starting from scratch. Now we're going to take a look at how to do these similar things in Premiere. Here we are in Adobe Premiere Pro, CS5, and I'm here using the trial version, so as you'll remember, Adobe limits you in the formats you can use in the trial. This sucks, so we can't use HD as easily, I guess, as we would be able to if we had the full version, but we're going to make do with what we've got. So when you start up Adobe Premiere Pro, you get this window where you can make a new project, open a project, or get some help. We are going to choose New Project. Oh, and you can also select an old project. This is one that I made yesterday. We're going to make a new one, though. And here are the options you get. Most of these you can ignore. And this is one of the things I really like about Premiere. You choose your format, and you name it. And we're going to call it Demo Project 2. And you can choose where you want to save your file. And if you go ahead and choose, whatever, wherever I just had, that seems like a good spot. Yep, that's where I want it. So I'm going to choose that. And that is the location of your project file. Cool. So what happens when I go to scratch disks? This is what I really like. Whereas Final Cut, you have to reset everything. In Adobe Premiere, you take this, and it automatically says, yeah, just store that in the same place as the project. You can also choose documents or set a custom location for any of these different folders that it creates for your scratch disks and your scratch files while you're editing, and those are just the files it generates when it captures video, captures audio, and renders stuff. So there you go. That's really all you need to set up. There's some other stuff here like setting title safe areas. You don't really need to worry about that if you're just making something for the web. If you're doing something for television, this is to make sure that the titles don't get cut off when you're on TV. That's probably not an issue for anyone watching this right now, so I wouldn't worry about it too much, but if you know what your title safe areas are, you can change them there. These are some other format things you can deal with. We're not going to get into that. It's not that important. We have created our project as desired. Well, this would be in HD if I had the option, but basically as desired. So I'm going to hit OK. We're going to get our project here. We're going to get to choose our format, and let's just go with DVC Pro HD 24, because then we can do in HD format. Premiere is going to bring up its normal deal here, and we can go ahead and drag in our footage if that's what we want to do. Yep. I would love to continue the trial. Thanks for asking. I'm going to drag in the footage right there. So you can see Premiere has now imported it, and I can search it with this box up here. So if I wanted to look for one file in particular, there it is. Anyway, we have our footage imported. Alternatively, if you want to import footage, you can do it from the import menu. And that's the easiest way to do it. If you want to capture footage, Adobe has a capture option for capture device. And this is how you would do what you can do in Final Cut, where you capture from a camera, set in and out points in the time code, and then have and log those all in, and then have Adobe Premiere capture that footage for you. Alright, so how do we edit in Adobe Premiere? It's very, very similar to Final Cut. So I'm just going to drag some footage out here, and as you can see, we're getting a red line, but that's okay because Premiere will actually still play it back. There we go. And I'm going to add this clip right here. So they're right next to each other. How do we actually add a transition? Let's say I want to cross dissolve, which is the default. Insufficient media. This is the same thing that you'll come into in Final Cut. Now I'm dragging this footage, effect out from the effects panel, which you can get by going to the window and choosing effects. Final Cut actually does this too. You'll notice that in your asset browser you also have an effects browser. So you can go ahead and whenever Final Cut, there we go, decides to respond, you can see video transitions, dissolve, cross dissolve, and you can go ahead and drop that right on there. And it has the exact same effect. But in Premiere, so that's how we're going to do it in here. So we're just going to drag these just like we did in Final Cut to, shorten the footage enough that we can apply a transition and drag cross dissolve right on top of it. And there we go, now we have an effect. So we're going from this, dissolve to this. And for having some issues with the format the footage is in, it's playing back pretty smoothly. This is playing back H.264 in Final Cut in Adobe Premiere as opposed to the problem it has in Final Cut. They both can do it, but it seems to be a bit smoother in here, which is a nice surprise. So what do we do when we're done with our edit? We need to export it. Well, export is where you might expect it, in the File menu under Export. So we can export it to Media, which will let us decide how we want to export that file. We can match the sequence settings, and it will just export it exactly as what our sequence is. Or we can go ahead and choose any QuickTime format. This is pretty much what you would expect in the QuickTime conversion option in Final Cut Pro, but it kind of combines both of them. And then you can go ahead and actually add some filters here. Why you would want to apply a Gaussian blur filter to your video, I'm not sure, but that is an option that Adobe has afforded you. So here we are. Here's your video codec. You can choose that. Your QuickTime video codec. You can choose your audio, choose uncompressed or something else, and you can even FTP the final product when it's done. So that's pretty cool, and you can queue these up. So there are a lot more options in here. It's actually a really nice setup that Adobe Premiere gives you. And then you can see the output version, what that's going to look like, so you can preview it. So a lot of good things that Adobe has put together in its export capabilities. Alternatively, if you feel like migrating this project to Final Cut, they let you do that too. You can export Final Cut Pro XML and import this project back into Final Cut. Adobe also lets you import Final Cut Pro XML. I've kind of found that this works sometimes, but it's nice that you have this option and options to export to other popular Pro formats. So that's that. That's how you edit in Final Cut Pro and Adobe Premiere, how you set up your projects. Now you can start editing very basically. We will talk about in much shorter lessons on the next few days how to add effects, how to color correct, and how to deliver your footage. So stay tuned for those, and thanks for watching. Wait. There's one more thing. Before we go, a lot of people have asked, what are you editing these screencasts with? And the answer to that is Screenflow. It's an application by Telestream. Mac users will probably be more familiar with the name Flip for Mac because they make the Windows Media component for Macintosh. And they have purchased and are now developing a product called Screenflow, which is the best screen capture and editing application. You're looking at it right now. You're looking at me editing this video, which is a little meta. And it's wonderful for doing some really basic video editing. whether it's screen captures or not, you can actually just go ahead and you know, drop the video file onto your timeline, regardless of where it is, and start editing it. And you can do some really neat things like just taking, where is my media? There it is. Just grabbing something you've recorded, dropping it on here, you drag it on there, right click, and you've got transitions. So it's really neat. It's not a professional video editing program, but for basic video editing and for screen sharing purposes, it's wonderful. It's also only $100, which is, you know, not cheap, but it is a low price if you consider, you know, well, if you're editing in Final Cut Express or Final Cut Pro, you're talking about $300 to $1,200, so it is considerably less than that. So if you're doing like really basic video editing and you miss the old timeline view of iMovie, that they still haven't been able to put back properly, then Screenflow is actually a really great way to edit your video. I edit a lot of videos for Lifehacker.com because we have to do it really quickly, and this goes straight to YouTube, and it's like phenomenally fast to edit your video. So if you are looking for a less professional option and want to do some exciting, easy things with video and make your video look pretty good and deliver it to the web, this is an option that will actually work quite well for you, especially if you're doing screencasts. So that is now I'm going to shut up. This is it. And I'll see you next time.